Air Force lessons across 12 decades, how innovation continues the mission. There is a moment, somewhere between the roar of an engine and the silence of open sky, where history is made. Not in a boardroom. Not in a political speech. But up there, thousands of feet above everything familiar, where a single decision, a single machine, a single human being can change the course of a war, a nation, or the world itself. And tonight, we are going to live inside those moments. We are going to walk through 12 decades of courage, invention, failure, triumph, and relentless determination. This is not just the story of aircraft. This is the story of people who refuse to accept limits. This is the story of the United States Air Force. Let us go back. Way back. To a field in North Carolina, in December of 1903. The wind is cold, the ground is hard, and two brothers from Ohio are about to do something that every educated person on the planet has told them is impossible. Orville Wright climbs onto a machine made of wood and canvas and wire, and for 12 seconds, he flies. 12 seconds. That is all it took to permanently alter the story of human civilization. Nobody in that field on that morning could have imagined that what they were watching would one day lead to supersonic jets, stealth bombers, unmanned drones, and spacecraft that leave the atmosphere entirely. But here we are. And every single thing the United States Air Force has ever done traces its bloodline back to those 12 seconds in Kitty Hawk. Now, the Air Force as an independent branch of the military did not exist yet in 1903. In those early years, military aviation was a wild, experimental, and honestly quite dangerous enterprise. The United States Army was the first to get serious about it. In 1907, just 4 years after Kitty Hawk, the Army Signal Corps established an aeronautical division. It had 3 people. 3 people and no aircraft. But there was a vision. There was a belief that the sky was not just a place to look up at. It was a place to fight from, to observe from, to control. And that belief, fragile and new as it was, planted the seed of everything that followed. The first military aircraft the Army actually purchased was the Wright military flyer in 1909. It flew at a blistering speed of 42 miles per hour. If you are laughing at that number right now, good. Hold on to that laugh, because in a few minutes we are going to be talking about aircraft that fly at more than 2,000 miles per hour, and the distance between those two numbers tells the whole story of what American military ingenuity can do in just over a century. But before we race ahead, let us slow down and appreciate what those early aviators were dealing with. There were no instruments. There were no radios. There were no ejection seats. There were no parachutes in the early years. You climbed into an open cockpit, you strapped yourself in with a leather belt if you were lucky, and you hoped the engine did not fail, the wings did not come apart, and the weather did not turn against you. These men were not reckless. They were not thrill seekers. They were professionals who understood the risk and accepted it because they believed in the mission. That ethos, that willingness to accept danger in service of something larger than yourself, has never left the Air Force. Not once. Not in 12 decades. By the time World War I began in 1914, European nations were already using aircraft for reconnaissance, and it did not take long before those reconnaissance aircraft started shooting at each other. The age of the fighter pilot was born. And while the United States did not enter that war until 1917, American aviators were already volunteering to fly with French and British squadrons. The Lafayette Escadrille, a squadron of American volunteers flying for France, became legendary. These men were adventurers, patriots, and warriors all at once, and their stories fired the imagination of a generation. When America officially entered World War I, the air service expanded rapidly but faced serious challenges. The United States had fallen behind Europe in aircraft development, and American pilots often had to fly French and British planes. This was a humbling reality, but it also taught an important lesson. Preparedness in aviation cannot be built overnight. It takes years of investment, years of training, years of iteration. That lesson would be learned, forgotten, and learned again across the decades. But each time it was relearned, it came at a cost. The war ended in 1918, and America demobilized rapidly. The aviation units that had been built up with such energy were cut back dramatically. Funding dried up. Aircraft sat in fields and rotted. But the aviators themselves did not give up. Men like Billy Mitchell were absolutely convinced that airpower was the future of warfare, and they were not going to stay quiet about it. Mitchell famously demonstrated in 1921 that aircraft could sink warships, a claim that naval officers had ridiculed, by sending his bombers against captured German battleships and sending them to the bottom of the ocean. The images were stunning. The message was undeniable. Airpower was real, and it was devastating. Mitchell paid a heavy personal price for his advocacy. He was court-martialed in 1925 for insubordination after publicly accusing military leadership of incompetence and criminal negligence in their management of aviation. He was convicted and essentially forced out of the military. But history vindicated him completely. Today, the Air Force's top enlisted award is named in his honor. The Billy Mitchell Award. A man punished for telling the truth now has his name on the highest recognition the service can give. That is a story worth sitting with for a moment. The institutions that silence visionaries sometimes end up celebrating them later, but only after the visionaries have been proven right by events that could have been prevented. Through the 1920s and 1930s, military aviation existed in this strange in-between space. There was genuine excitement and progress. Air races were capturing the public imagination. The Transcontinental Air Race, the Pulitzer Trophy races, the Thompson Trophy races were packed with spectators and covered breathlessly by the press. American pilots were setting speed records and endurance records. Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic alone in 1927 and became perhaps the most famous person on Earth overnight. The romance of aviation was at its absolute peak. But inside the military, the debates about airpower were fierce and often bitter. Naval officers and Army ground commanders were deeply resistant to the idea that aviation deserved an equal seat at the table. Budget fights were brutal. The Army Air Corps, as it was called from 1926 onwards, had to fight for every dollar, every airplane, every training slot. And yet, within that constrained environment, remarkable things were happening. The development of long-range bombers in the 1930s was one of the most consequential decisions in American military history. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress began its development in 1935. When it first flew, it was the most advanced bomber in the world. It could fly higher, farther, and carry more bombs than anything else in existence. And the strategic concept behind it, daylight precision bombing, was bold and controversial. The idea was that formations of heavily armed bombers could fly deep into enemy territory in broad daylight, defend themselves against fighters with their own guns, and destroy specific industrial and military targets with precision. It was a compelling theory. And like many compelling theories, it ran into the brutal friction of reality when war actually came. Because December 7, 1941, changed everything. Pearl Harbor did not just bring the United States into World War II. It lit a fire under American industrial and military capacity that the world had never seen. Within months, factories that had been making cars were making tanks and planes. Women who had never been inside a factory were building bombers. The production numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. The United States produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft during World War II. 300,000. Germany produced about 120,000. Japan produced about 76,000. American industrial output literally overwhelmed the Axis powers, and air power was at the center of that story. But production was only part of it. The men who flew those planes faced conditions that would break most human beings. Let us talk about the bomber crews for a moment, because their story deserves far more attention than it usually gets. A crew on IB-17 was 10 men. They flew at altitudes of 25,000 feet or higher, where temperatures could drop to 60 degrees below zero. The aircraft were not pressurized, not fully. The heating systems were unreliable. Oxygen masks froze. Frostbite was a constant danger. And all of this was before the enemy even showed up. The German air defenses over occupied Europe were ferocious. Anti-aircraft artillery, the flak, filled the sky with black explosions. A box of flak could shred a bomber in seconds, and crews had to fly straight and level through it while the bombs were dropping, no evasive maneuvers, just straight and level while metal fragments tore through the aircraft and through the men inside it. And then the fighters came. The Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s were fast and deadly and flown by pilots who were fighting for their homeland. The loss rates on some missions were catastrophic. On October 14, 1943, during the Second Schweinfurt raid against German ball-bearing factories, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day. 600 men. Gone. In one mission. And the men who survived that day came back and got ready to fly again. That level of courage is not something you can legislate or manufacture. It comes from somewhere deep inside a person, and it is sustained by the men on either side of you, the crew you eat with and sleep near and trust with your life every single morning. Unit cohesion, that deep bond between people who share extreme danger, has been one of the most consistent and powerful forces in every chapter of Air Force history. Technology changes. Aircraft change. Missions change. But the bond between the people who fly and maintain and support those aircraft, that stays constant. The Pacific theater of World War II presented an entirely different set of challenges. The distances were vast, the islands were scattered, and the Japanese forces were skilled and determined. American naval aviation, operating from aircraft carriers, became one of the decisive weapons of the Pacific War. The Battle of Midway in June of 1942 is one of the most extraordinary military engagements in history. American dive bombers, finding a gap in the Japanese air defense cover, sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single afternoon. 4 carriers. The naval balance of the Pacific shifted in an afternoon because of air power precisely applied at exactly the right moment. And in the island-hopping campaign that followed, Army Air Forces and Navy aviation worked together to establish air superiority over each island before the ground troops went in. It was the beginning of what would become a foundational doctrine: air superiority is not a luxury. It is the prerequisite for every other military operation. You cannot move troops, cannot supply them, cannot protect them without controlling the air above them. That principle, born in the fire of World War II, remains as true today as it was in 1943. The war ended in August of 1945, brought to its final conclusion by 2 events that no one on Earth had ever seen before. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9 were delivered by B-29 superfortresses, the most advanced aircraft of the war. The Enola Gay and Bockscar carried weapons that each destroyed an entire city in a single detonation. The moral debates about those decisions have continued for 80 years and will likely continue forever. But militarily, the message was clear. Air power, combined with nuclear weapons, had become the most destructive force in human history. And the United States Air Force would be responsible for controlling it. In September of 1947, the United States Air Force became an independent branch of the military, separate from the Army for the first time. It was a recognition of what World War II had demonstrated beyond any argument: air power was not a supporting tool for ground forces. It was a full and equal dimension of warfare. The first Secretary of the Air Force was Stuart Symington. The first Chief of Staff was General Carl Spaatz. And from that moment, the Air Force began building itself into something the world had never seen. The Cold War that settled over the world in the late 1940s gave the Air Force its defining mission for the next 4 decades. Strategic nuclear deterrence. The idea was both simple and terrifying. If the Soviet Union knew that any nuclear attack on the United States would result in a devastating nuclear response from the Air Force, they would never launch. The mutually assured destruction doctrine was the most stable form of deterrence ever devised, precisely because both sides knew the consequences were unsurvivable. And the aircraft that carried this burden were extraordinary. The B-36 Peacemaker, which entered service in 1948, was the largest piston-engine aircraft ever built. Its wingspan was wider than the length of a modern football field. It could fly non-stop from bases in the continental United States to targets in the Soviet Union and back without refueling. 10 engines, 4 of them jet engines added later to improve performance, a crew of 15, and the capacity to carry a nuclear weapon to any point on the globe. There was something almost surreal about it. This enormous, slow-moving aircraft, humming through the stratosphere with its terrible cargo, was the thing standing between the world and a third world war. But technology never stands still. The jet age had arrived, and the pace of change in military aviation during the late 1940s and 1950s was absolutely breathtaking. In October of 1947, just 1 month after the Air Force became independent, Chuck Yeager climbed into the Bell X-1 rocket plane at Muroc Army Airfield in California and became the first human being to fly faster than the speed of sound. He named the aircraft Glamorous Glennis, after his wife. He had cracked 2 ribs the night before in a horse-riding accident and had not told the flight surgeons. He figured out how to close the cockpit door with a broomstick because the broken ribs made it too painful to use his arm properly. And then he went supersonic. The sound barrier had been a genuine engineering and physiological mystery. Some researchers believed that the shock waves built up near the speed of sound would literally tear an aircraft apart. Others thought the aerodynamic forces would be uncontrollable. Yeager proved them all wrong, and the experience he described was almost anticlimactic. A little buffeting on the way up, and then, at Mach 1.06, suddenly smooth. The sound barrier was not a wall. It was a door. And the Air Force had just walked through it. What followed in the 1950s was a decade of astonishing acceleration. Aircraft that had seemed impossibly advanced in 1947 were obsolete by 1955. The F-86 Sabre, which fought MiG-15s over Korea in the early 1950s in history's first jet-versus-jet air combat, was itself replaced within years by the F-100 Super Sabre, which could fly supersonic in level flight. Then came the F-104 Starfighter, which could fly at twice the speed of sound. Then the F-105 Thunderchief. Then the F-4 Phantom. Each generation faster, higher, more capable than the last. Korea deserves its own deep examination, because it was the Air Force's first real combat test as an independent service, and it produced lessons that shaped doctrine for generations. The conflict began in June of 1950 when North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel, and American air power was immediately deployed in an attempt to slow the advance. The early missions showed both the tremendous potential and the real limitations of air power. Bridges were destroyed and rebuilt. Supply lines were attacked but kept functioning. The terrain was brutal, the weather was terrible, and the enemy was resourceful and determined. The air superiority battles over MiG Alley, the corridor of northwestern Korea where American and Soviet-built North Korean jets clashed, were intense and professionally contested. American pilots flying the F-86 Sabre proved that American pilot training and tactics were superior to their opponents, achieving a kill ratio that by some estimates exceeded 10-1. That achievement was not accidental. It reflected the Air Force's emphasis on pilot quality and realistic training. The best technology in the world is worthless if the person operating it is not superbly trained. Korea reinforced that truth in blood. But Korea also revealed gaps. The Air Force had been so focused on the nuclear strategic mission that some of its conventional warfare capabilities had atrophied. Close air support for ground troops, the coordination between aircraft and soldiers fighting on the ground, was not as smooth as it needed to be. These lessons would be studied, incorporated into doctrine, and then, frustratingly, partially forgotten again before Vietnam came along and forced them to be relearned. The reconnaissance mission of the Air Force in the Cold War is one of the most fascinating chapters in the entire history of American intelligence. In the mid-1950s, the Eisenhower administration was deeply worried about Soviet strategic intentions. How many bombers did they have? Where were their missile sites? What were their actual military capabilities? The Soviets were obsessively secretive, and conventional intelligence methods were not providing the answers that American planners needed. The solution was the U-2. Developed in absolute secrecy by Lockheed's Skunk Works division, the U-2 was a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft that could fly at altitudes above 70,000 feet, well beyond the reach of Soviet interceptors or surface-to-air missiles. Or so it was believed. Beginning in 1956, U-2 flights over the Soviet Union produced intelligence photographs of extraordinary value. Airfields, missile sites, submarine bases, nuclear facilities, all laid out in stunning photographic detail for American analysts to study. The program was a remarkable intelligence triumph. And then, on May 1, 1960, a Soviet surface-to-air missile brought down a U-2 flown by Francis Gary Powers deep inside Soviet territory. The incident created an international crisis. The United States initially denied the nature of the mission, not knowing that Powers had survived and been captured. When the Soviets produced Powers, the wreckage of the aircraft, and the photographic equipment, the lie collapsed. The Eisenhower administration was deeply embarrassed, a planned summit with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was cancelled, and the Cold War grew significantly colder. The lesson was pointed and painful. Even the most sophisticated technical collection systems have vulnerabilities, and when those vulnerabilities are exploited, the political consequences can be severe. The U-2 program, despite the Powers incident, continued and continues to this day, though the aircraft was eventually supplemented by the even more remarkable State Route 71 Blackbird. The State Route 71, also a Skunk Works product, was the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever built. It cruised at Mach 3.2, more than 3 times the speed of sound, at altitudes above 80,000 feet. The aircraft generated so much heat from aerodynamic friction that it expanded several inches in flight. Its fuel tanks leaked on the ground but sealed when the aircraft heated up at cruise speed. The titanium structure required new manufacturing techniques because the United States did not have enough titanium machining capability to build it with existing methods. The entire aircraft was an engineering revolution. In 24 years of operational service, not a single State Route 71 was ever shot down by an enemy. When missiles were launched at it, the pilots simply accelerated away. Think about that for a moment. The response to a missile attack was to go faster. The aircraft was its own defense. Nothing in the Soviet arsenal, not their fastest interceptors, not their surface-to-air missiles, could touch it. It flew so high and so fast that it existed in its own operational dimension, and when it finally retired in 1998, pilots who had flown it mourned it like a lost partner. Vietnam was the Air Force's most complex and in many ways most painful experience. The war began in earnest for the United States Air Force in the early 1960s with advisory missions, escalated dramatically after the Gulf of Tonkin incidents in 1964, and became a full-scale air campaign that lasted more than a decade. The lessons were brutal, complicated, and in some cases contradictory. Let us work through them carefully, because they shaped the Air Force more than any other conflict of the Cold War era. The fundamental problem in Vietnam was that the Air Force had spent the 1950s preparing to fight a nuclear war against the Soviet Union. The aircraft, the weapons, the tactics, and the doctrine had all been oriented around that mission. And then the Air Force was asked to fight a counterinsurgency war in a jungle against an enemy who was politically sophisticated, deeply motivated, and remarkably resilient. The mismatch was severe. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic aircraft designed to deliver nuclear weapons at low altitude, became the primary strike aircraft over North Vietnam. It was fast and capable, but it was flying missions it had never been designed for, dropping conventional bombs on bridges and supply depots while dealing with some of the most sophisticated air defenses in the world. North Vietnam, supplied by the Soviet Union, fielded surface-to-air missiles, radar-guided anti-aircraft guns, and MiG fighter aircraft. The threat environment was unlike anything American pilots had trained for. In the early air-to-air combats over North Vietnam, American pilots flying the F-4 Phantom were shocked to find that their kill ratios against North Vietnamese MiG pilots were far below what they had achieved in Korea. The F-4 had been designed without an internal gun because weapons theorists had concluded that missiles had made guns obsolete. That conclusion proved spectacularly wrong in the close range, turning fights over North Vietnam, where missiles often failed to track and pilots found themselves wanting a gun desperately. The aircraft was eventually given a gun pod, and later models had an internal gun, but the lesson was expensive. More broadly, the air-to-air kill ratios alarmed the Air Force and the Navy. American pilots were technically capable and flew capable aircraft, but North Vietnamese pilots, trained by Soviet advisors and flying in their home territory with ground-controlled intercept radars vectoring them onto advantageous positions, were proving to be genuinely dangerous opponents. Something had to change. The Navy's answer was Top Gun, the Naval Fighter Weapons School established in 1969 at Miramar. The Air Force developed its own advanced training programs. The emphasis was on realistic, unrestricted dogfight training against instructors flying like real opponents, not scripted engagements designed to make students look good. The results were measurable and dramatic. After the new training programs were implemented, kill ratios improved significantly. Realistic training saves lives. That is not a complicated lesson, but it is one that has to be defended constantly against budget pressures and institutional inertia. The strategic bombing campaign over North Vietnam, Operation Rolling Thunder, ran from 1965 to 1968 and was arguably the most controversial air campaign in American history. The problems were not primarily tactical or technical. They were political and strategic. Washington micromanaged the target selection to an extraordinary degree. Individual targets required approval at the highest levels of government. Certain targets, including the vital port of Haiphong through which Soviet supplies arrived, were off-limits for extended periods. The bombing pauses ordered to signal willingness to negotiate were used by North Vietnam to repair damage and resupply. Airmen who risked and died to strike specific targets found those same targets rebuilt and operational within weeks because the campaign lacked continuity and clear strategic logic. General Curtis LeMay, who had commanded the strategic bombing campaign against Japan and built the Strategic Air Command into the most powerful military force in history, famously said that the way to win in Vietnam was to bomb North Vietnam back into the Stone Age. He meant it as a statement about the need for decisive, unrestricted air power. Whether that approach would have worked, whether it would have been morally acceptable, remains deeply contested. But what most military historians agree on is that the halfway measures, the restricted campaigns with political constraints that changed weekly, were the worst of all options. They inflicted enormous cost in aircraft and aircrew while achieving insufficient strategic effect. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 shattered American public confidence in the war even though it was a military defeat for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. The subsequent decision to begin withdrawal, the Vietnamization program, and eventually the Paris Peace Accords of 1973 ended direct American involvement. The Air Force's final major operation in Vietnam, Linebacker II in December of 1972, was a concentrated 11-day campaign of B-52 strikes against Hanoi and Haiphong that many analysts credit with bringing North Vietnam back to the negotiating table. But it came too late to change the fundamental political outcome. What Vietnam ultimately taught the Air Force, at enormous cost, was this: air power is a precision instrument in skilled hands, but its effectiveness is inseparable from the strategy it serves. If the strategy is unclear, contradictory, or politically compromised, air power cannot compensate. The machine can be perfect. The pilots can be brilliant. The bombs can hit exactly where they are aimed. And none of it matters if the campaign as a whole does not connect tactical actions to strategic objectives in a coherent, consistent way. The years immediately following Vietnam were difficult for the entire American military. Morale was battered, budgets were cut, and a generation of officers was wrestling with what had gone wrong. But within the Air Force, and within the broader defense establishment, serious people were doing serious work. The result would be a revolution in military affairs that transformed how wars are fought. The 1970s saw the beginning of the precision-guided munitions revolution. Laser-guided bombs, tested in the final years of Vietnam, pointed toward a future where a single aircraft could reliably destroy a single target. The implications were profound. In World War II, destroying a specific target might require hundreds of aircraft dropping thousands of bombs, with enormous collateral damage and significant aircraft losses. Precision guidance changed that calculus fundamentally. You could now send 2 aircraft with 2 bombs and hit the target with a very high probability. Fewer sorties, less exposure, less collateral damage, and the same or better military effect. Simultaneously, the Air Force was developing a new fighter that would define air-to-air combat for decades. The F-15 Eagle, which entered service in 1976, was designed specifically to win dogfights. Its thrust-to-weight ratio meant it could climb almost vertically. Its radar was the most powerful ever put into a tactical aircraft. Its avionics and weapons systems were generations ahead of anything else in service. And its pilots were trained with the intensity that Vietnam had shown was absolutely essential. The F-15 has an air-to-air combat record of more than 100 kills with 0 losses. Not one F-15 has ever been shot down in air-to-air combat. That record has held for 50 years. The F-16 Fighting Falcon, which came along shortly after, was a completely different philosophy. Where the F-15 was large, powerful, and twin-engine, the F-16 was small, lightweight, and built around agility. It was the first aircraft with a fly-by-wire control system, where the pilot's stick movements were translated into electronic signals rather than mechanical linkages to the control surfaces. The F-16 was designed to be aerodynamically unstable, constantly on the edge of losing control, because an unstable aircraft is more maneuverable. The fly-by-wire computers made thousands of tiny corrections every second to keep it in the air. The result was the most agile fighter aircraft in the world, a pure air combat machine that could also deliver weapons with precision. And then there was the program that almost nobody knew existed. Stealth. The development of stealth technology, the ability to make aircraft effectively invisible to radar, was one of the most closely held secrets in American aviation history. The fundamental physics had been understood since the 1960s. A Soviet mathematician named Pyotr Yefimtsev had published papers on radar cross-section reduction that had been largely ignored in the Soviet Union. American engineers at Lockheed Skunk Works read those papers and realized their implications. If you shaped an aircraft in specific ways and coated it with radar-absorbing materials, you could reduce its radar cross-section to the size of a small bird. A fighter-sized aircraft would simply not appear on enemy radar. The F-117 Nighthawk, the first operational stealth aircraft, flew for the first time in 1977. Its shape was strange, almost geometrically impure, a collection of flat faceted surfaces that looked unlike any aircraft ever built. That was because the shape was dictated entirely by stealth requirements. Engineers had calculated exactly which angles would deflect radar energy away rather than back to the source, and those were the angles the aircraft was built with. The aerodynamics were terrible. The F-117 was, by conventional standards, a terrible flying aircraft. The fly-by-wire computers that managed it were flying a machine that wanted to tumble at every moment. But the radar cross-section was almost unmeasurably small. The F-117 first saw combat in Panama in 1989 during Operation Just Cause. And then, in January of 1991, it became the most famous aircraft in the world. Operation Desert Storm was the defining air campaign of the late 20th century. When Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990 and the coalition assembled to reverse that invasion began planning the air campaign, the F-117 was given the most dangerous targets in Baghdad. The Iraqi air defense network was one of the densest in the world, built with Soviet equipment and staffed by operators who had years of experience. The city was ringed with surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns. Flying a conventional aircraft into downtown Baghdad in a hostile environment would have been suicidal. On the night of January 17, 1991, F-117s flew through the center of Baghdad and precisely destroyed command and control facilities, communications nodes, air defense command centers, and other critical targets. The Iraqi air defense system fired blindly into the night. They could hear the aircraft, because the F-117 reduced radar signature, not acoustic signature, but they could not get a weapons quality track on the targets. And in the hours that followed, as the massive coalition air campaign unfolded, F-117s were the only aircraft that flew into the heart of Baghdad on the most dangerous missions. 0 F-117s were lost to enemy action over Baghdad. The images that came back were extraordinary. Cameras mounted on the laser-guided bombs recorded their terminal guidance runs, and the footage of bombs entering specific windows of specific buildings, of an aircraft shelter being destroyed while the one next to it was untouched, was something the public had never seen before. Precision had reached a level that previous generations of airmen would have found literally impossible to believe. The concept of sending a 2,000-pound bomb through a ventilation shaft was not science fiction. It was operational reality. Desert Storm lasted 42 days of air campaign followed by 100 hours of ground combat. The Iraqi army, the fourth largest in the world at the time, was shattered. Coalition casualties were remarkably light. The air campaign had done what its architects had designed it to do. It had isolated the Iraqi army in Kuwait, destroyed its supply lines, degraded its command and control, and broken its will to resist before a single coalition ground soldier crossed the border. It was the clearest demonstration of what modern air power, properly planned and properly executed, could achieve. But success brings its own dangers. The triumph of Desert Storm created a temptation to believe that air power could achieve decisive strategic results in any conflict, against any opponent, without the messy complications of ground forces, without significant casualties, without the political costs of sustained commitment. That belief would be tested in the 1990s and found to be more complicated than the optimists had hoped. The 1990s were, paradoxically, both a golden age of American air power and a decade of complex, ambiguous challenges. The Air Force flew combat operations over Iraq continuously through the decade, enforcing no-fly zones in the north and south of the country. It flew over Bosnia and eventually conducted a major air campaign over Serbia in 1999. And it was developing new aircraft and new capabilities at a remarkable pace. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, which made its public debut in 1988 and entered service in 1997, was the most technologically sophisticated aircraft ever built. Where the F-117 had been a faceted, angular machine, the B-2 was a pure flying wing, curves everywhere, every surface designed to blend into the aerodynamic and stealth requirements simultaneously. It was beautiful in an alien way, like something designed by mathematics rather than by hands. And its capabilities were extraordinary. A B-2 could fly from Missouri to anywhere in the world, deliver 16 2,000-pound precision bombs, and return without refueling. Or it could carry 8,500-pound bombs. Or two 30,000-pound bunker-busting massive ordnance penetrators. The range of options available to a single aircraft was almost absurd. The B-2 cost roughly $2 billion per aircraft. That number has generated debate ever since. Is a $2 billion aircraft cost-effective? When you factor in what it can achieve, when you compare it to the cost of alternative approaches to the same military objectives, the answer is more complicated than the headline number suggests. 21 B-2s in the inventory can hold at risk any target on Earth within a matter of hours without requiring forward basing, overflight permissions from allies, or any of the diplomatic and logistical infrastructure required by shorter-range aircraft. The strategic flexibility that provides is genuinely unique. But the program was deeply expensive, and only 21 were built rather than the original planned fleet of 132. Kosovo in 1999 was Operation Allied Force, NATO's air campaign to compel Slobodan Milosevic's Serbia to halt the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. It ran for 78 days and became the center of a fierce intellectual debate about air power's strategic potential. Advocates pointed to the eventual result: Milosevic agreed to NATO's terms, Kosovo was spared, and not a single NATO aircrew member was killed in combat throughout the campaign. Critics pointed out that the campaign was far longer than its architects had initially claimed, that Milosevic's capitulation may have owed as much to the implicit threat of a NATO ground invasion as to the airstrikes themselves, and that the campaign had significant collateral damage problems. One F-117, the first ever lost in combat, was shot down over Serbia on March 27, 1999. The Serbian military, using older Soviet radar systems that operated on different frequency bands than those the F-117 had been optimized to defeat, was able to detect and track the aircraft. An SA-3 missile hit it, and the pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko, ejected and was rescued. The loss of the first stealth aircraft was a shock. It was a reminder that even the most advanced technology has boundaries, that creative adversaries working with older equipment can find unexpected vulnerabilities, and that in warfare, no technological advantage is permanent. Then came September 11, 2001. And everything changed again. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were the worst attacks on American soil since Pearl Harbor, and like Pearl Harbor, they transformed the Air Force's operational tempo and its sense of purpose in ways that are still being felt today. Within hours of the attacks, Air Force fighters were airborne over American cities for the first time in the service's history, prepared to shoot down hijacked civilian aircraft if necessary. It was a moment of terrible clarity about the new kind of warfare the nation faced. The campaign in Afghanistan began on October 7, 2001, with strikes by cruise missiles and Air Force and Navy aircraft. Within weeks, the Taliban government had been driven from power. The speed of the initial success owed much to a genuinely innovative approach: special operations forces on the ground, communicating with Afghan Northern Alliance fighters and calling in precision air strikes on Taliban and Al-Qaeda positions. The combination of a small number of Americans on the ground with a massive air presence overhead proved devastating. Targets that would have required large conventional ground forces were destroyed from the air within minutes of being identified. But then the long war began. And the Air Force found itself performing missions that had no precedent in its history. Close air support in mountainous terrain, against an enemy who lived among the population and used villages and urban areas as cover. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance at an unprecedented scale and persistence. Airlift of troops and supplies to remote outposts that could not be reached by road. Medevac missions that saved lives that would have been lost in any previous war. The tempo was relentless, the conditions were harsh, and the Air Force performed year after year after year without breaking. Iraq in 2003 added a second theater of operations. Operation Iraqi Freedom began with an air campaign that was, in some ways, even more precise and more overwhelming than Desert Storm had been 12 years earlier. The term shock and awe, used to describe the massive coordinated strikes on Iraqi command and control infrastructure in the opening hours of the war, entered the cultural vocabulary. 1,000 strikes on the first night. Targets going dark in real time. Baghdad lit up with explosions while CNN broadcast live from the Rashid Hotel. It was the most widely watched opening night of a war in history. The ground campaign moved faster than almost anyone had predicted. Baghdad fell within 3 weeks. But the war that followed, the insurgency, the sectarian conflict, the decade-plus of counterinsurgency, proved far more challenging for the Air Force than any kinetic campaign. The service had to adapt continuously, developing new tactics, new technologies, and new organizational structures to deal with threats that had not existed in its doctrine books. The development and expansion of unmanned aerial vehicles, what most people call drones, during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars was one of the most significant military technology developments of the 21st century. The Predator drone had actually been developed in the 1990s, initially as a reconnaissance platform. But after September 11, it was armed with Hellfire missiles, and the combination of persistent surveillance and precision strike capability in a single platform proved transformative. A Predator could orbit an area of interest for 24 hours or more, watching targets, building pattern-of-life intelligence, and striking when the opportunity arose. And unlike a manned aircraft, the crew was sitting in a ground control station, often in Nevada, thousands of miles from the combat zone. The ethical and legal debates about drone warfare continue to this day, and they are important debates. When lethal force can be applied from a location on the other side of the world, by operators who are not in physical danger, the questions about oversight, accountability, collateral damage assessment, and the threshold for using force become more complicated. The Air Force has wrestled seriously with these questions, developing increasingly rigorous processes for target identification and strike authorization. But the questions themselves are not going away, and they will intensify as autonomy in military systems increases in the coming decades. The Global Hawk unmanned aircraft, which entered service in the early 2000s, extended the Air Force's reconnaissance capability in ways that would have seemed impossible just a generation earlier. A Global Hawk could fly at 60,000 feet for 30 hours continuously, covering an enormous geographic area with sensors of extraordinary sensitivity. A single Global Hawk mission could provide intelligence that would have required dozens of U-2 missions in the Cold War. The trade-offs between manned and unmanned systems, the relative advantages of each, the roles that human beings need to play in the cockpit versus on the ground, have become one of the central debates in Air Force development. The F-22 Raptor, which entered service in 2005, represented the fifth generation of fighter aircraft. Where the fourth generation, the F-15 and F-16 and their contemporaries, had relied on superior performance and training, the fifth generation added two more dimensions, stealth and sensor fusion. The F-22's radar cross-section was tiny. Its onboard computers fused information from multiple sensors, radar, infrared, electronic warfare systems, data links from other aircraft and from ground stations, and presented the pilot with a single integrated picture of the battle space. The pilot was not managing individual sensors. The aircraft was doing that automatically, allowing the pilot to focus on decision-making and tactics. The F-22's air-to-air capabilities are classified, but what has been publicly acknowledged suggests it is capable of engaging multiple targets at long range before any opponent could know it was present. The combination of stealth, supercruise, supersonic flight without afterburners, extreme agility, and sensor fusion creates a combination of capabilities that no other aircraft in the world currently matches. 580 aircraft were originally planned. Budget pressures reduced the final buy to 187. That decision remains controversial among Air Force planners, who argue that the force is too small for the threat environments they expect to face. The F-35 Lightning II program, the most expensive weapons program in American history, was designed to provide a multi-role stealth aircraft in three variants, one for the Air Force, one for the Navy, and one for the Marine Corps with short takeoff and vertical landing capability. The program has faced significant criticism for cost overruns, schedule delays, and technical problems. Some of those criticisms are fair. The development was genuinely troubled. But the operational capability the aircraft provides, fifth-generation sensor fusion and stealth in a platform that can be produced in large numbers and maintained in the field, represents a genuine leap in capability that previous aircraft simply cannot match. The Air Force that fights today is unrecognizable compared to the organization that existed in 1947. Its aircraft are more capable by orders of magnitude. Its precision is essentially absolute. Its ability to project force globally without basing rights is unprecedented. Its information systems allow coordination between aircraft, ground forces, naval forces, and national intelligence agencies in real time across thousands of miles. The integration of capabilities that would have been science fiction in 1947 has become routine operational procedure today. Cyber warfare has added an entirely new domain to the Air Force's responsibilities. The service's information warfare and cyber capabilities are among its least publicized but most significant assets. The ability to operate in the electromagnetic spectrum, to protect Air Force systems from adversary cyber attacks while developing the capacity to disrupt and degrade adversary systems, has become a core competency. The adversaries who have most invested in countering American air power, particularly China and Russia, have focused heavily on electronic warfare and cyber capabilities precisely because they recognize that air dominance through traditional aircraft versus aircraft competition is difficult to achieve against the United States. Space has always been closely tied to the Air Force's mission. Since the earliest military satellites of the late 1950s, Air Force personnel had been responsible for operating the space systems that support all of American military power. GPS, the Global Positioning System, which most of the world uses every day without thinking about it, was originally a military system developed by the Air Force specifically to enable precision navigation for aircraft, missiles, and ground forces. The precision guidance revolution in munitions that transformed warfare in Desert Storm was fundamentally enabled by GPS. Every time a bomb hits its target within a meter, GPS is part of why. The establishment of the United States Space Force in December of 2019, as the sixth independent branch of the American military, was a formal recognition of the importance of space operations. The Space Force absorbed the Air Force's space personnel and programs, and its mission reflects the recognition that space is not a benign environment. China and Russia have been developing capabilities to disrupt, degrade, and destroy American space assets. Protecting those assets, and developing the ability to operate effectively in a contested space environment, has become a national security priority. The B-21 Raider, the Air Force's newest stealth bomber, which made its first flight in 2023, represents the next generation of strategic air power. It was designed from the beginning with the lessons of the B-2 program in mind: build it to be maintainable in the field, design it for lower cost per aircraft, ensure it can penetrate the most advanced air defense systems that exist today and those expected to exist in the coming decades. The B-21 will eventually replace both the B-1 and the B-2 in the Air Force inventory, providing a more modern and more numerous force of stealth bombers. In a world where China has built one of the most sophisticated integrated air defense systems ever constructed, the ability to penetrate that system and hold critical targets at risk is not a hypothetical capability. It is a fundamental deterrence requirement. Advanced training today looks nothing like training in the early days of military aviation. The combination of live-fly exercises, high-fidelity simulation, and data analytics has created a training ecosystem of extraordinary effectiveness. The Air Force's aggressor squadrons, whose pilots specialize in flying like adversary air forces, provide realistic training that prepares combat pilots for the most challenging environments. Exercises like Red Flag at Nellis Air Force Base are among the most realistic and demanding combat training events in the world, and the data shows that pilots who have survived Red Flag perform measurably better in actual combat. The human dimension of Air Force service has also evolved enormously over 12 decades. The force that first took to the sky was entirely male, entirely white, and largely from specific regional and educational backgrounds. The Tuskegee Airmen of World War II, black aviators who overcame systematic discrimination to become some of the finest combat pilots in the Army Air Forces, demonstrated conclusively that talent and courage are not racially distributed. Their record, escorting bombers deep into Germany and defeating the Luftwaffe in air-to-air combat with remarkable effectiveness, was irrefutable. And yet integration of the armed forces did not come until President Truman's executive order in 1948, and full practical integration took years more. Women have served in Air Force roles throughout the service's history, initially in support and logistics functions, then in an expanding range of technical and operational positions. Women were first permitted to fly combat aircraft in 1993, and since then female pilots have flown combat missions in every Air Force aircraft type. Today, women serve in every Air Force career field, including special operations and combat rescue. The expansion of who is permitted to serve, and in what roles, has made the Air Force more capable, not less, drawing on the full range of American talent and dedication. Mental health, an issue that was invisible or stigmatized for most of Air Force history, has received increasing attention in recent decades. The cumulative stress of repeated combat deployments, the unique psychological challenges of drone warfare where operators engage in lethal operations and then drive home to their families in Nevada, the moral injury that can come from making life-and-death decisions under uncertainty, are all real and significant concerns that the Air Force is working to address with greater seriousness than at any previous point in the service's history. Looking at the future, the Air Force faces challenges that are in some ways more complex than any in its past. The return of great power competition with China and Russia requires capabilities and postures that are different from those optimized for counterterrorism and counterinsurgency over the past 2 decades. China, in particular, has invested heavily in anti-access and area denial capabilities, long-range missiles, advanced fighter aircraft, sophisticated air defense systems, and electronic warfare, specifically designed to make it difficult for the United States to operate in the Western Pacific. The Air Force's response is a combination of longer-range systems, more capable stealth platforms, greater resilience through dispersal and redundancy, and investments in autonomous systems and artificial intelligence. The question of autonomous and AI-enabled military systems is perhaps the most profound and difficult one the Air Force and the entire military is grappling with today. The potential advantages are enormous. Unmanned combat aircraft can be smaller, more maneuverable, and capable of sustaining G-forces that would kill a human pilot. Artificial intelligence can process sensor data and make targeting recommendations faster than any human. Autonomous logistics systems can reduce the vulnerability of supply chains. But the questions about human control, about accountability, about the thresholds for use of lethal force, about the risk of errors and unintended escalation, are serious and do not have easy answers. The Air Force has stated clearly that it intends to maintain meaningful human control over lethal force decisions, but what that means in practice as autonomy increases is a question that will occupy military lawyers, ethicists, and commanders for the foreseeable future. Advanced manufacturing, including additive manufacturing, what most people call three-dimensional printing, is beginning to transform Air Force logistics in ways that could be profoundly important. The ability to print spare parts in the field, rather than waiting for them to be shipped from depots, could dramatically improve aircraft availability in remote or contested environments. Materials science advances are producing new structural materials that are lighter and stronger than anything previously available, enabling new aircraft designs that were not feasible before. Directed energy weapons, including high-energy lasers and high-power microwave systems, are moving from laboratory demonstrations toward operational deployment. A laser weapon that can disable enemy aircraft, missiles, and drones at the speed of light, with a deep magazine limited only by the aircraft's power generation, represents a fundamental shift in the economics of air defense. Each laser shot costs a fraction of a cent. Each interceptor missile costs millions of dollars. If directed energy weapons can reliably defend against drone swarms and cruise missiles, they change the cost calculus of aerial attack dramatically. The hypersonic weapons race is another development that will shape Air Force capabilities in the coming decade. Hypersonic missiles, those that fly at Mach 5 or faster on maneuvering trajectories, are significantly harder to intercept than conventional ballistic missiles precisely because they combine extreme speed with unpredictable flight paths. Both China and Russia have demonstrated hypersonic weapons capabilities, and the United States is developing its own hypersonic strike weapons as well as defenses against adversary hypersonic systems. The Air Force's role in both delivering and defending against hypersonic weapons is central to the service's planning for future conflict. What does all of this mean? What does 12 decades of Air Force history teach us, when we step back and look at the whole arc from Kitty Hawk to hypersonic weapons and artificial intelligence? There are things that have changed so dramatically that they seem to have nothing to do with each other. And there are things that have not changed at all. What has not changed is the character of the people. The young lieutenant climbing into a cockpit in 1942 to fly against the Luftwaffe and the young pilot climbing into a simulator to train for the most advanced combat aircraft in the world today share something essential. They have chosen to spend their professional lives in service to the security of the nation they love. They have accepted a life of discipline, sacrifice, frequent relocation, and genuine danger, not because they had no other choices, but because they believed the mission mattered. That choice, made freely and renewed daily, is the foundation that all the technology rests upon. What has not changed is the importance of training. Every period in Air Force history where training was allowed to atrophy was followed by a painful relearning of why it matters. Every investment in realistic, rigorous, uncomfortable training has paid dividends in lives saved and missions accomplished. This is not a subtle lesson. It has been demonstrated over and over again across 12 decades. And it still has to be fought for against budget pressures and institutional comfort every year. What has not changed is the relationship between technology and adaptation. The Air Force has always faced adversaries who are trying to find and exploit vulnerabilities. The Soviets built missiles to counter the U-2. The North Vietnamese built radar-guided guns to counter American jets. The Serbians found radar frequencies that could detect the F-117. The Chinese have built anti-access systems to counter American carrier aviation. The adversaries never stop adapting. And so the Air Force cannot stop adapting either. The lesson of 12 decades is not that any particular technology provides permanent advantage. The lesson is that the process of innovation must be continuous, that complacency is always the most dangerous enemy, and that the willingness to look honestly at failures and change is the quality that separates organizations that survive from those that do not. What has not changed is the fundamental importance of air superiority. From the Western Front in 1917 to the skies over Taiwan in whatever conflict may or may not come, the side that controls the air controls the tempo and the outcome of the campaign. The Air Force's foundational mission has not changed. What has changed is everything about how that mission is executed. And what has not changed, perhaps most importantly of all, is the human capacity to look at a sky that seems impossible to cross and decide to cross it anyway. The Wright brothers looked at a world where nobody had ever sustained powered flight and decided to be the first. Chuck Yeager looked at a sound barrier that his instrument panel told him might shake his aircraft apart and pushed the throttle forward anyway. The crews who flew through the flak over Germany, who pressed their attacks against the most dangerous air defenses in the world, who flew in the dark over Baghdad knowing that the most sophisticated air defense network on Earth was looking for them, all of them were doing the same thing that Orville Wright did on that cold December morning in 1903. They were deciding that the mission was worth it. That the sky, however hostile, could be navigated. That what lay on the other side of the impossible was worth reaching. 12 decades. Hundreds of thousands of men and women. Thousands of different aircraft types. Dozens of wars and conflicts and crises. An evolution from 12 seconds of flight to a bomber that can circle the globe. From a Wright military flyer that topped out at 42 miles per hour to an aircraft that cruises faster than a rifle bullet. From canvas and wood to composites and stealth coatings and artificial intelligence. The distance traveled is almost incomprehensible. But the soul of the mission has not traveled at all. It is exactly where it has always been. In the hands of people who look up at the sky and see not a limit but a highway. Not a barrier but a birthright. Not the end of what is possible but the beginning. That is the United States Air Force. That is 12 decades of innovation, sacrifice, adaptation, and unyielding commitment to a mission that the world depends on, whether it knows it or not. And the next chapter is being written right now, by people in flight suits and flight simulators and research laboratories and maintenance hangars, who are doing exactly what every generation before them has done. They are refusing to accept the limits they were handed. They are reaching for the sky.